The front door slammed shut with a deafening finality, cutting Edward off from the only home he'd ever known. "I didn't raise a son to be like this," his mother had screamed, her voice breaking with disgust after he'd finally whispered the truth. He was gay. At 18, standing on the cracked sidewalk of their quiet Ohio town, with nothing but a duffel bag and the echo of her words, Edward felt the world tilt beneath him. Rain began to fall, soaking through his thin jacket as he walked to the bus station, each step heavier than the last. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way her face had twisted when she found his journal hidden under the mattress, pages filled with confessions about the boy at school who made his heart race. No goodbye from his father, who simply stared at the floor, and no hug from his younger sister Sarah, who had watched from the stairs with wide, frightened eyes. The Greyhound ride to Chicago took 14 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Edward pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching farmland blur into city lights, wondering if he was broken, if loving another man made him unworthy of the family that had once seemed so solid. By the time he stepped off the bus into the bustling terminal, his stomach growled and his wallet held only $43. He spent the first night in a cheap motel on the south side, staring at the peeling ceiling, fighting back tears that threatened to drown him. The next morning, hunger drove him out into the streets. He wandered through neighborhoods alive with the scent of coffee and fresh bread, his feet aching until he spotted a handwritten sign in the window of Morning Glory Cafe. "Help wanted." Inside, the place smelled like cinnamon and hope. An older woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted apron greeted him. "You look like you could use a fresh start, kid," Mrs. Elena Vargas said after he mumbled his story. She didn't ask for references, just handed him an apron and put him to work washing dishes and learning to knead dough. Days turned into weeks. Edward slept on a cot in the back room she offered, saving every penny. The work was grueling, but the rhythm of mixing batter and shaping loaves gave him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. At night, alone with his thoughts, the shame still clawed at him. He questioned everything: his identity, his future, whether anyone could ever love him without conditions. Yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, as the ovens warmed the kitchen, a small spark of defiance grew. He was more than his mother's rejection. He had to be. One crisp autumn afternoon, while Edward arranged pastries in the display case, a customer caught his eye. The man was tall, with tousled dark hair and an easy smile that lit up the room. "These croissants look like art," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Bryan. You new here?" Their conversation flowed naturally, Bryan sharing stories of his freelance graphic design work, while Edward talked about learning to bake. For the first time since leaving home, Edward felt seen, not judged. As Bryan left with a bag of muffins, he glanced back with a warmth that lingered in Edward's chest long after the door closed. Little did he know, that simple exchange would become the foundation of everything that came next. Weeks passed, and Bryan became a regular at Morning Glory. He'd linger over coffee, sketching designs on napkins while Edward worked the counter during his lunch breaks. Their talks deepened from casual banter to late-night conversations after closing. Bryan listened without pity as Edward finally opened up about the night his mother slammed the door, the way her words still echoed in his nightmares. "You're not an abomination, Edward," Bryan said softly one evening as they sat on the cafe steps under streetlights. "You're brave for living your truth." Those words cracked something open inside Edward, a crack that let in light instead of darkness. Bryan invited him to his small apartment one weekend to experiment with recipes. They laughed over failed batches of sourdough, flour dusting their clothes like snow. Edward discovered Bryan had his own scars, raised by a single dad who never quite understood his artistic dreams, but never rejected him outright. Their friendship blossomed into something deeper, tentative touches and shared glances that made Edward's heart race in a way no journal entry ever could. One rainy night, after perfecting a new lemon tart recipe, Bryan leaned in and kissed him gently. It was soft, full of promise, and for Edward, it was the first time love didn't feel like a secret to hide. The cafe thrived under Edward's growing skill. Mrs. Vargas promoted him to assistant baker, teaching him her secret family recipes passed down through generations. Edward poured his pain into the dough, creating pastries that customers raved about, each one a small victory over the voice in his head that still whispered he was unworthy. Yet doubts lingered. When Bryan suggested they move in together to save money, Edward hesitated, flashbacks of his mother's disgust making him pull back. "What if I'm too broken for this?" he confessed one morning. Bryan held him close. "Then we'll fix it together, one day at a time." By spring, they had pooled their savings and dreams. Bryan designed the logo, a simple haven symbol, while Edward perfected his signature cinnamon rolls. They found a tiny storefront in a bustling Chicago neighborhood, signing the lease with shaking hands. Opening Haven Bakery felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. The first day, with fresh bread cooling on racks and the bell above the door jingling, Edward looked at Bryan and felt a surge of hope. The identity crisis that once consumed him began to fade, replaced by quiet pride. He was building something real, something his own, and for the first time he believed he deserved it. Haven Bakery hummed with life from the start. Customers lined up for Edward's flaky croissants and Bryan's hand-drawn menu boards. Long hours blurred together, Edward waking before dawn to mix dough, while Bryan handled marketing from his laptop in the corner. Financial stress tested them daily. One month, the oven broke, forcing them to borrow from friends and work double shifts. Edward's old panic attacks returned in the quiet hours, memories of Ohio flooding back when bills piled up. "What if I fail and end up on the street again?" he'd whisper to Bryan in the dark. Bryan would pull him close, reminding him of their progress one batch at a time. Their relationship deepened through those trials. They shared their first public date at a local pride festival, holding hands openly for the first time. Edward's heart soared as Bryan kissed him under string lights. No shame, no hiding. Yet society still pushed back. A few regulars muttered under their breath when they saw the two men working side by side. But the community rallied, word spreading about the gay bakers with heart. Edward found strength in that support, his self-acceptance growing with every sale. Success came slowly but surely. A food blogger featured their lavender honey scones, and overnight, lines stretched down the block. Edward hired 2 part-time helpers, freeing time for new recipes inspired by his journey, like a resilience roll packed with nuts and spices. Bryan expanded the space with cozy seating and art from local creators. In the midst of it all, Edward received a letter from his sister Sarah. She had tracked him down online, writing that their mother was struggling financially after their father passed. Edward stared at the words, anger and old pain surging. Bryan encouraged patience. "You don't owe them anything, but maybe this is your chance to close the chapter." Edward folded the letter away, focusing instead on the bakery's growth. For the first time, he felt in control of his story. The bakery's reputation exploded. Edward's innovative twists on classic American pastries drew crowds from across the city. He expanded to catering weddings and corporate events, the profits allowing them to renovate the upstairs into a cozy loft. Bryan proposed during a quiet evening in the kitchen, sliding a simple ring across the flour-dusted counter. "You've built this life with me, Edward. Marry me?" Tears welled as Edward said yes, the moment sealing their bond forged through struggle and love. News from home arrived more frequently. Sarah's calls revealed their mother's mounting medical bills and mounting debt. Edward's internal battle raged. Part of him wanted to turn away, to let the rejection stand as final. Yet another part, shaped by Bryan's steady compassion, felt the pull of duty. He started sending anonymous money orders through Sarah, dipping into their savings without telling Bryan at first. The sacrifice stung, late nights worrying over spreadsheets, but it eased the guilt that had lingered since Ohio. A misunderstanding nearly shattered everything. Bryan discovered the transfers and confronted Edward, hurt flashing in his eyes. "Why hide this from me? We're partners." Edward explained his conflicted heart, the fear that helping would reopen old wounds. They talked through the night, Bryan understanding the depth of Edward's pain but urging honesty. Your family hurt you, but you're not them. The crisis strengthened their trust. Edward continued the support quietly, watching Haven Bakery thrive while wondering if forgiveness was possible. Community friends noticed his distraction, offering advice that helped him process the layers of identity and belonging he still navigated. When Sarah called in tears saying their mother had been hospitalized, Edward could no longer stay silent. He drove back to Ohio with Bryan at his side, the familiar roads stirring a storm of emotions. The hospital room felt smaller than he remembered. His mother, frail in the bed, looked up with shock when he entered. Edward! Old accusations hung unspoken, but Sarah revealed the truth. She had been the one who accidentally left the journal visible years ago, not out of malice but fear. The misunderstanding that fueled the expulsion unraveled slowly. Confrontation came raw and real. His mother admitted her harsh words stemmed from her own upbringing, strict beliefs that left no room for his truth. I was scared for you, she whispered, voice breaking. Edward shared his journey, the bakery, the love with Bryan, the life he built despite everything. A former friend from town appeared unexpectedly, confessing he had spread rumors that deepened the family rift. Betrayal stung, but Edward chose grace, walking away from the anger that once defined him. The decision to help openly meant risking his hard-won peace, pouring bakery profits into medical care and home repairs back home. Bryan stood by him through sleepless nights and tearful calls, their relationship the anchor. Edward's awakening unfolded in quiet moments, realizing his worth wasn't tied to acceptance, but to the man he had become. He hired Sarah part-time at the bakery, giving her a fresh start too. The family began tentative visits to Chicago, watching Edward and Bryan work side by side with new eyes. Haven Bakery became more than a business, it turned into a bridge. Edward's mother arrived one crisp fall morning, standing in the doorway with tears as she tasted his signature cinnamon roll. You did this? She said softly, the apology implicit in her gaze. Sarah helped behind the counter, learning recipes and mending bonds. Bryan organized family dinners upstairs, laughter replacing old silence. Edward watched it all, the sacrifices worthwhile, his growth complete. He no longer questioned his place in the world. Love with Bryan had taught him resilience, family had taught him forgiveness, and the bakery had taught him purpose. The community celebrated their story, local papers featuring the baker who rose from rejection. Edward expanded to a second location, hiring more staff and mentoring young people facing their own identity struggles. Evenings ended with him and Bryan walking hand in hand through the neighborhood, the city lights mirroring the peace in his heart. The family that once cast him out now gathered for holidays, supporting the life he built. Edward's journey had come full circle, not through erasing the past but through transforming it. True or false? Forgiving those who hurt you most is always the path to true peace.